Tonight, we uncover a history so fragile, so meticulously erased, that entire civilizations vanished from memory without a trace. Libraries that once held the laws, myths, and wisdom of the world were set ablaze. Manuscripts that recorded the cosmos, medicine, and human thought lost forever. Sacred stories whispered through generations disappeared when scribes, conquerors, and zealots decided what was worthy of survival. From the clay tablets of Nineveh to the codices of the Maya, knowledge was preserved, copied, and hidden only to be stolen, destroyed, or forgotten. Temples, monasteries, and palaces that served as vaults of human achievement became silent. The histories of people, their gods, and their understanding of the world were rewritten, lost, or buried beneath centuries of fire and fear. And those who tried to safeguard what remained risked everything. Priests, scholars, and scribes vanished with the secrets they protected. Texts that survived were fragmented, scattered, or recast to serve the agendas of power. Yet through the margins, the fragments, and the whispers, traces remain, waiting for those willing to follow the shadows of forgotten libraries. So before the journey begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because tonight we explore how sacred stories were burned, erased, and hidden from the world, and what remains to be rediscovered. Before there were nations or borders, there were stories, and those stories were the memory of humanity. Long before printing presses and stone monuments, people trusted fragile things to carry truth. Clay tablets dried in the sun, papyrus rolled into scrolls, parchment scraped thin from animal skin. These objects held laws, myths, prayers, calculations, and names. They defined who belonged, who ruled, and who was remembered. When a text survived, a people survived with it. When it vanished, so did entire worlds of meaning. This is the reality often forgotten when we talk about lost knowledge. In the ancient world, information did not live everywhere at once. It lived in one room, one shelf, one archive, guarded by a small group of scribes. If fire reached that room, or soldiers reached that city, centuries of thought could disappear in hours. There were no copies waiting somewhere else, no backups hidden across continents. What burned was not just ink, but identity. Archaeology confirms this fragility again and again. The earliest writing systems in Mesopotamia were impressed into clay around the 4th millennium before the Common Era. These tablets recorded grain rations, contracts, hymns, and myths. Many survived only because cities like Ur and Nineveh were destroyed by fire, which hardened the clay and preserved it by accident. Texts written on papyrus in Egypt did not have that luck. Most decayed, silently leaving gaps where voices once spoke. Even sacred knowledge was vulnerable. Early religious traditions depended on constant copying to stay alive. A scroll not recopied would rot. A tablet not protected would crack. Scribes were not neutral machines. They chose what to preserve. Kings, temples, and priesthoods decided which texts deserved time labor and materials. Power and belief shaped memory from the beginning. History shows that libraries were never just buildings. They were systems. They required money stability-trained readers and political will. When any part failed, knowledge slipped through the cracks. During wars, archives were targeted because conquerors understood their power. Destroy the records and you control the story. This is why ancient rulers boasted of burning enemy texts. It was a victory over the past. Modern readers often imagine knowledge as permanent because words feel fixed on a page. In reality, ancient knowledge lived on the edge of extinction every day. A flood could erase a city archive. A change in religion could make old myths forbidden. A new language could make old texts unreadable. Loss did not always come with flames. Sometimes it arrived quietly, through neglect. Understanding this changes how we see the past. The gaps in history are not proof that nothing happened. They are evidence of how easily memory can be erased. What we inherit today is not the full record of human thought. It is what survived chance, power, and time. And that truth should make us cautious whenever history seems complete. Remembering this fragility is the first step to understanding why lost libraries still shape what we believe today and tomorrow too. Before books existed, knowledge moved through breath and memory. Sacred traditions lived in voices, not pages. Across the ancient world, people memorized long epics, hymns, prayers, and laws. These words were repeated aloud until they became part of the body. Rhythm, rhyme, and ritual helped memory survive. This oral world was not primitive. It was precise and disciplined. A single mistake could change meaning, so communities trained specialists to remember correctly. Priests, poets, and elders became living libraries trusted to carry truth across generations. In places like ancient Mesopotamia, India, and Greece, sacred knowledge existed long before writing fixed it. The Vedas were spoken for centuries before being written down. Homeric epics were sung by bards who followed strict formulas. In early Israel, laws and stories were recited publicly again and again. Accuracy mattered because belief depended on memory. Writing was rare, expensive, and often restricted. Voice was faster, more flexible, and shared by all. When communities gathered to speak together, knowledge stayed alive. This system worked until conditions changed. Oral traditions rely on stable communities and continuous practice. War, migration, famine, or conquest could break the chain. When elders died or temples fell, knowledge could vanish quickly. Writing emerged as protection against this loss. Early scripts like cuneiform and hieroglyphs allowed words to outlive their speakers. But writing also froze traditions. What was written became fixed while living voices faded. Authority slowly shifted from those who remembered to those who controlled texts. The moment sacred speech entered writing, it became vulnerable in new ways. A spoken tradition could adapt, survive, and move. A written one depended on material survival. Scrolls could rot, crack, or burn. Languages could change, making texts unreadable. Those who could read gained power over those who could not. Access narrowed. Meaning became something interpreted rather than shared. This transformation laid the groundwork for future losses. When libraries burned, they destroyed not just ink, but the last echoes of voices that once filled temples and fields. Understanding this oral beginning is essential to understanding loss. Sacred stories were never fragile because they were simple. They were fragile because they depended on people. When writing replaced voice, something powerful was gained, but something living was lost. Memory became an object instead of a relationship. From this point forward, knowledge could be locked, hidden, edited, or destroyed. The silence left behind would later be mistaken for emptiness. In truth, it marked the places where human voices once carried the sacred without walls or archives. These traditions shaped ethics, calendars, and identity long before rulers codified belief. Losing them means losing ways of seeing the world that cannot be rebuilt fully. What survives is partial filtered and often misunderstood. This is why burned libraries matter, even when writing came later. They ended chains that began in breath and song. those silences still shape modern history education and belief systems today, more than we realize, because absence often speaks louder than surviving words from the ancient past of humanity itself. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, writing did not begin as poetry or philosophy. It began as control. Around the 4th millennium, before the Common Era, temples and palaces started keeping records on clay tablets. These records tracked grain labor taxes, land, and offerings to the gods. Writing was born not to preserve memory, but to manage power. From the beginning, text and authority were bound together. Mesopotamian cities like Uruk-Lagash and later Babylon built archives inside religious and royal centers. These were not public spaces. They were guarded rooms where trained scribes worked under elite supervision. The ability to read and write was rare. Scribes belonged to a privileged class educated for years. Their work carried divine weight because rulers claimed their laws and decisions were approved by the gods. Recording them made that claim permanent. Temple archives held hymns, prayers, rituals, and omens. Palace archives held treaties, laws, military orders, and census lists. Together, they created a complete picture of reality as defined by the state. If something was written, it existed. If it was not written, it was invisible. This gave enormous power to those who controlled the archive. They could decide what was remembered and what was forgotten. The famous law code of Hammurabi carved into stone around the 18th century, before the Common Era, shows this clearly. The text begins by stating that the king was chosen by the gods to bring order and justice. The law itself became sacred not because of morality, but because of divine authorship. Writing turned authority into something that could not be argued with. A spoken order could be challenged. A written law stood above debate. These archives also shaped religion. Myths like the Enuma Elish were copied and stored alongside administrative texts. Creation stories supported political order by placing kings at the center of a divinely arranged world. Ritual calendars aligned worship with taxation and labor cycles. Sacred and practical life merged on the same tablets. There was no clear line between belief and bureaucracy. Archaeology shows how fragile this system was. When cities fell, archives were often destroyed or buried. Fires baked some tablets and preserved them by chance. Others dissolved into dust. Entire libraries vanished when temples were abandoned. What survives today represents only a fraction of what once existed. Thousands of voices and ideas disappeared without leaving a trace. This is why Mesopotamia matters so deeply in the history of lost knowledge. It shows that writing did not simply record truth, it created it. Archives were tools of power long before they were tools of learning. When later civilizations inherited this model, they inherited its risks. Burn the archive, and you erase legitimacy. Control the archive, and you control memory. The first great libraries were never neutral. They were instruments of rule, and when they fell, history fell. With them, leaving silence where certainty once lived for centuries to come. In the 7th century, before the Common Era, one king understood something few rulers before him had considered. Ashurbanipal of Assyria believed that power did not only come from armies or tribute, but from knowledge itself. In the city of Nineveh, he ordered the collection of texts from across his empire. Priests, governors, and scribes were commanded to send copies of important writings to the royal capital. What emerged was one of the earliest known attempts to preserve the total memory of a civilization. Ashurbanipal's library was not built from paper or parchment. It was built from clay. Thousands of tablets were inscribed with cuneiform writing and stored in palace rooms. They contained myths, prayers, medical texts, astronomical observations, legal codes, and royal correspondence. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story already ancient, even in Ashurbanipal's time. This epic explored mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning themes that still resonate today. The king himself was unusually educated. Inscriptions describe him as trained in reading and writing, a rare skill for royalty. He saw texts as weapons against chaos. By preserving the words of the past, he believed he could stabilize the future. Unlike earlier archives focused on administration, this collection aimed to gather sacred and scholarly knowledge. It was an early vision of preservation for its own sake. The survival of these texts is one of history's great accidents. In the year 612, before the Common Era, Nineveh fell to invading forces. The city was burned and destroyed. The palace collapsed. Fire swept through the archive. But instead of erasing the tablets, the heat hardened them. Unfired clay became ceramic. What should have been destruction became preservation. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 19th century, they uncovered thousands of broken tablets buried under rubble. Reassembling them revealed stories long thought lost. Without this accident, the Epic of Gilgamesh would be unknown today. Entire branches of Mesopotamian thought would be silent. This survival was not due to careful protection over time, but to the material itself. This contrast matters. Later, civilizations relied on papyrus, parchment, and paper. These materials were lighter, easier to copy, and easier to destroy. Fire reduced them to ash. Water turned them to pulp. Clay endured. Ashurbanipal's library reminds us that what survives is often shaped by physical chance, not cultural value. It also reveals a shift in thinking. For perhaps the first time, a ruler attempted to collect knowledge beyond immediate use. This was preservation, rather than simple control. Yet, even this effort depended on empire. When the empire fell, the system collapsed. Ashurbanipal's library stands as both a triumph and a warning. It shows that preservation is possible, but fragile. The survival of ancient stories often depends on accidents rather than intention. What we know of the ancient world exists because clay endured fire when paper would not. And for every text saved at Nineveh, countless others written on softer materials vanished forever, leaving gaps we can never fill. In the early 3rd century, before the Common Era, a bold idea took shape on the shores of Egypt. The rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty believed knowledge itself could be conquered. In Alexandria, they imagined a library that would gather every book, every scroll, and every tradition worth knowing. This was not just a building, but a statement of power. To rule the world of ideas was to rule memory itself. Alexandria's library grew alongside a research center known as the Mouseion, a place devoted to learning under royal patronage. Scholars were invited from Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. They were given food, housing, and status in exchange for study and teaching. Texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, law, and religion filled its halls. Sacred stories were not excluded. Myths from different cultures sat side by side even when they contradicted each other. The Ptolemies enforced aggressive collection policies. Ships entering Alexandria's harbor were searched for books. Originals were seized, copied, and stored. Copies were returned, while the originals stayed behind. This practice spread texts rapidly, but also centralized control. Alexandria became a magnet pulling knowledge from across the Mediterranean into one place. Translation was central to this project. Works written in different languages were rendered into Greek, which became the archive language of the library. One famous example is the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, traditionally dated to the 3rd century before the Common Era. This act transformed sacred texts by placing them into a new linguistic and cultural frame. Meaning shifted subtly through translation shaping later belief systems. The scale of the collection remains debated. Ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands of scrolls, though exact numbers are uncertain. What matters more is intention. For the first time, an institution sought completeness. Rival traditions were not destroyed, but absorbed. Knowledge was categorized, compared, and edited. Scholars corrected texts, standardized versions, and removed variants they considered errors. This process had consequences. Standardization preserved some texts, but erased others. Alternative versions disappeared. Oral traditions lost authority once written forms were fixed. What survived reflected scholarly judgment backed by royal power. Alexandria's greatness was also its weakness. By concentrating so much knowledge in one place, it made memory vulnerable. The library depended on political stability and funding. Over centuries, the city changed hands. Fires, conflicts, and neglect damaged its collections. Loss came slowly, not in a single moment. By late antiquity, the dream of total knowledge had faded. What survived traveled outward, influencing later Islamic and European scholarship. What vanished left silence. Alexandria remains a symbol because it reveals a truth. Preservation and control often walk together. The library expanded human understanding, but it also decided which voices mattered most. When it declined, humanity did not lose everything, but it lost the illusion that knowledge could ever be safely gathered in one place forever. Its legacy reminds us that even the greatest archives depend on fragile human choices, time, power, and the unpredictable survival of material memory across centuries of history. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is often imagined as a single night of fire, where all knowledge vanished at once. History does not support that image. There was no single moment when the entire library burned to the ground. Instead, the loss of Alexandria's collections unfolded slowly across centuries shaped by war-neglect politics and changing priorities. What disappeared did so in pieces, not in one dramatic blaze. One of the earliest incidents linked to loss occurred in the 1st century before the Common Era, during the Roman Civil War. Julius Caesar set fire to ships in the harbour to block enemy forces. Ancient writers later claimed that nearby storehouses containing books were damaged. If scrolls were lost, they were likely copies stored near the docks, not the core collection itself. Still, it marked the beginning of vulnerability. Alexandria was no longer protected by a stable scholarly court. Over the following centuries, control of the city shifted repeatedly. Roman rule replaced Greek administration. Funding for the Mausoleum declined. Scholars dispersed. Libraries depend on constant care, copying, and replacement. Without that support, scrolls decayed naturally. Papyrus does not survive neglect. Silence can destroy knowledge as effectively as fire. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, Alexandria faced internal conflict. Civil unrest, religious tension, and imperial decline weakened institutions. Pagan temples lost influence as Christianity spread. Some collections may have been abandoned or repurposed. The Serapeum, a temple complex associated with a secondary library, was destroyed in the late 4th century after imperial orders against pagan worship. Accounts describe the demolition of statues and buildings. Whether large collections of books still existed, there remains debated. Later traditions blamed the final destruction on the Arab conquest in the 7th century of the Common Era. This claim appears centuries after the event and lacks reliable contemporary evidence. Most historians reject it. By that time, the Great Library, as once imagined, likely no longer existed. What remained were fragments scattered across private collections, churches, and schools. What matters is not who delivered the final blow, but how fragile centralized knowledge proved to be. Alexandria relied on political support, tolerance for scholarship, and stable institutions. When these conditions eroded, the library faded with them. No single ruler chose to erase all knowledge. Instead, each generation failed to protect what it inherited. This slow disappearance explains why some works survived elsewhere. Texts copied in Asia Minor Rome or later in the Islamic world lived on. Others that existed only in Alexandria vanished without record. Their absence created the illusion that nothing had ever been written. Silence replaced memory. The myth of a single burning is comforting because it simplifies loss. It gives us one villain, one moment, one cause. Reality is harder to face. Knowledge usually dies, not through drama, but through neglect, disinterest, and fragmentation. Alexandria teaches that preservation is a process, not an event. When that process stops, even the greatest library fades quietly. The story of Alexandria is not about one fire, but about many small failures spread across time until memory itself was exhausted and the dream of total knowledge slipped beyond recovery forever. The survival of ancient knowledge was never guaranteed by ideas alone. It depended on materials, money, and political competition. One of the clearest examples of this truth is the city of Pergamon, which rose as a rival to Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. Pergamon did not merely collect texts. It challenged the very system that made libraries possible. Pergamon sat in Asia Minor along important trade routes. Its rulers invested heavily in scholarship to strengthen prestige and authority. Like Alexandria, it built a major library supported by royal funds. Scribes were trained, paid, and protected. Scholars were invited to live and work under patronage. Knowledge flourished because power chose to support it. But Pergamon faced a problem that revealed how fragile libraries truly were. Papyrus, the main writing material of the ancient world, came almost entirely from Egypt. When relations between Pergamon and the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt soured, supplies were restricted. This was not an accident. It was a political decision. Control of writing material became a weapon. In response, Pergamon turned to an alternative. Animal skin was processed into parchment, which was more durable than papyrus. This innovation allowed copying to continue even without Egyptian resources. Parchment could be written on both sides, folded, and bound more easily. Over time, it became central to the development of the codex, which would later replace scrolls. This shift shows that survival of knowledge depended on logistics as much as ideas. A library without materials could not function. A scribe without payment could not copy. When rulers withdrew, funding, copying stopped. Texts decayed and vanished. Preservation was expensive, slow, and continuous. Trade routes also shaped survival. Cities connected to commerce moved texts across regions. Those cut off became isolated. When wars disrupted trade networks, libraries suffered. Knowledge followed roads, ports, and ships. Where trade collapsed, memory followed. Competition between centers like Alexandria and Pergamon encouraged copying, comparison, and classification. But it also centralized power. Libraries grew where rulers wanted influence. When political priorities changed, libraries declined. Scholars were dismissed. Archives were abandoned. Pergamon demonstrates that preservation was never neutral. Decisions about which texts to copy reflected ideology, language, and cultural loyalty. Greek works were favored. Local traditions often ignored. What survived was shaped by taste and politics, not by universal value. When Pergamon eventually fell under Roman control, its library declined. Some texts were absorbed into Roman collections, others disappeared. Innovation in material could not save a system without long-term support. This chapter in history reveals a simple truth. Libraries survive only when material supply, political will, and economic networks align. Remove anyone, and knowledge fades. Pergamon did not fail because ideas lacked power. It failed because preservation depends on systems that are always temporary. Understanding this helps explain why so much ancient knowledge vanished, even without flames or conquest. When empires fall, the fate of knowledge is rarely considered by those who fight and die in their streets. Texts are left behind. Scribes lose their patrons. Libraries become empty rooms. Without funding, without protection, without a network of people to copy and preserve them, books and scrolls vanish. This is not myth. History shows it again and again. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era left vast gaps in administrative records, literature, and sacred texts across Europe. Cities once rich with archives were abandoned or destroyed. Documents that had survived centuries of copying were suddenly orphaned. Without the support of courts, temples, or local governments, no one could replace damaged manuscripts. Paper and parchment rotted, or were burned for warmth. Clay tablets cracked. The physical survival of knowledge was tied to the political survival of those who maintained it. Sacred stories faced the same peril. The epic, the hymn, the prayer, the legal code, all depended on continual attention. Priests, scribes, and scholars acted as living extensions of the archive. When kingdoms fractured, funding disappeared, and religious authority shifted, the people who had carried memory with them were dispersed or killed. Texts without caretakers lost their continuity. Libraries did not fall in a single moment. They decayed slowly as the systems that supported them dissolved. In North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the remnants of Hellenistic collections survived longer because cities remained centers of administration and learning. In Western Europe, however, the instability following the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 meant that institutional support vanished almost entirely. Monks became the last line of preservation, but even their reach was limited. Only texts deemed essential for religious practice were copied repeatedly. Everything else faded into silence. This selective preservation shaped what future generations inherited. Ideas that had been common knowledge in the 3rd and 4th centuries could be entirely unknown 100 years later. Political collapse also meant that copying became risky or impossible. In the chaos of invasion and famine, even a minor library could be looted, burned, or dismantled for building materials. Stories that had no immediate sponsor disappeared quietly rather than violently. This pattern repeated across history. The fall of the Byzantine city of Antioch in 676 destroyed numerous manuscripts. The sacking of Toledo in the early 8th century dispersed texts into private hands, leaving no organized archive. Knowledge that had survived centuries of copying could vanish overnight when social structures supporting it failed. These orphans were not simply lost to time, they were casualties of the fragile system that had sustained them. Preservation requires stability, resources, and human attention. When empires fracture, texts become dependents without guardians. What remains in the historical record often reflects what survived these collapses, not what existed before. Understanding this helps explain why entire traditions, once flourishing, vanished without trace. When memory depends on power, and that power disappears, silence becomes the most common outcome. In that silence, sacred stories are lost, not destroyed by fire or sword, but abandoned, fading quietly into history's shadows, leaving gaps that may never be filled. In 218, before the Common Era, China was unified under Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. He sought more than political control. He wanted a single cultural and intellectual order. Knowledge itself became a target. Books that contradicted official policy or presented alternative ideas were ordered burned. Confucian classics, histories, and philosophical writings were destroyed to enforce uniformity. This was not chaos, but deliberate state action. Written memory was reshaped to support imperial authority. The Qin book burnings reveal how standardization can erase memory as effectively as fire or neglect. Scholars who owned prohibited texts were punished, some executed. Scribes were required to copy only approved material. Laws, administrative records, and texts that reinforced the emperor's legitimacy were preserved. Anything that offered competing perspectives on ethics, governance, or history was removed. What survived reflected a curated version of culture, rather than the full range of human thought. The scale of destruction is debated by historians, but multiple sources confirm widespread loss. Confucian scholars recorded that thousands of volumes were lost. The emperor's advisors prioritized texts that celebrated his rule or provided practical governance. Storytelling, poetry, and regional traditions fell victim. In many cases, what was burned had existed for centuries. Knowledge that had survived kingdoms, wars, and natural decay disappeared because it challenged centralized power. This episode also illustrates how written memory can be manipulated to enforce ideological unity. By controlling which texts were copied and which were destroyed, the Qin dynasty shaped how future generations understood the past. History became what the state sanctioned. Alternative voices were silenced. The result was a narrower worldview imposed from the top down. Education and scholarship were limited to approved narratives. Curiosity outside the state's framework was dangerous. Despite this repression, not all knowledge vanished. Some texts survived in private hands, hidden by families or secret communities. Oral traditions preserved certain teachings, even when written versions were lost. Later dynasties, particularly the Han, attempted to recover and reconstruct forbidden works. This reconstruction shows both the resilience of human memory and the difficulty of completely erasing knowledge. Once ideas exist in multiple forms, total suppression is nearly impossible. The Qin burnings also demonstrate the intersection of political power and cultural authority. Unifying an empire required more than armies. It required controlling how people thought about history, law, and morality. Standardization can erase diversity of thought, even without mass violence. The Qin dynasty's approach was systematic, targeting not individuals alone, but the very materials that carried memory across generations. Understanding this event helps explain why some traditions in China seem discontinuous or fragmented. What we have today represents what survived imperial suppression, reconstruction, and reinterpretation. What was lost reminds us that central authority can rewrite memory by controlling books, materials, and copying practices. The Qin book burnings are a clear example of how unity imposed from the top can create silence in the historical record, leaving a world shaped as much by absence as by presence. In ancient India, monasteries were more than places of worship. They were centers of learning and preservation. From as early as the 3rd century, before the Common Era, Buddhist monastic complexes served as living libraries. Monks copied texts meticulously. They recorded sutras, philosophical treatises, and ritual instructions on palm leaves. Hindu temples and mathas functioned in similar ways, preserving Vedic hymns, commentaries on law, medicine, and astronomy. These centers ensured that knowledge survived in a world where political instability could erase entire traditions. Monks followed strict routines to safeguard texts. Copying was done carefully with attention to accuracy. Mistakes were corrected through cross-referencing with older manuscripts. Inscriptions and colophons recorded authorship, dates, and lineages of teachers. Learning was both memorized and written. This dual system made the knowledge resilient. Even if one manuscript was damaged, another copy or the oral transmission could preserve the content. The geographic spread of monasteries added to this protection. Sites like Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Takshashila became hubs, attracting scholars from across South Asia and beyond. They held hundreds of texts on philosophy, logic, grammar, medicine, and mathematics. Students traveled long distances to study and carry knowledge back to their regions. This network created redundancy. Texts were never confined to one place, reducing the risk of complete loss. These monastic libraries also preserved competing ideas. Different schools of thought within Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism coexisted. Commentaries were written to explain and debate interpretations. The process of commentary itself became a form of preservation. Even when original texts were lost, detailed explanations could survive. Knowledge was layered, creating depth and resilience over time. Material choices mattered. Palm leaves, birch bark, and other durable materials were selected and treated to last. Manuscripts were stored carefully in wooden boxes or on shelves within protected halls. Climate and handling were challenges, but disciplined practices allowed many works to survive centuries. The labor-intensive process ensured that what was copied was valued, reducing casual loss. Political support was another factor. Kings and local rulers often patronized monasteries. Donations funded copying, repairs, and housing for scholars. When empires declined, some texts were relocated or hidden. The monastic system itself acted as a buffer against the collapse of secular institutions. Sacred knowledge could continue, even if the surrounding political order was unstable. This system ensured that India retained a vast intellectual tradition across centuries. When European travelers arrived in the first millennium of the Common Era, they found texts and learning preserved that might have otherwise been lost during periods of warfare and invasion. Many of these works later influenced scholars in Asia and the Islamic world, carrying Indian knowledge across continents. India's monasteries demonstrate that preservation is an active process requiring discipline, organization, and commitment. They show that books alone do not preserve knowledge. People do. Communities trained to care for texts over generations create continuity. The careful copying, commentary, and distribution practiced in these centers ensured that vast philosophical and ritual traditions survived and shaped human thought long after their original authors were gone. Nalanda was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Founded in the 5th century of the Common Era in Bihar, India, it attracted scholars from across Asia. Monks studied Buddhist philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and literature. The library was vast, holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts written on palm leaves and other durable materials. Texts were meticulously copied, stored, and preserved. For centuries, knowledge flowed through its halls uninterrupted, forming a network of intellectual continuity. The strength of Nalanda came from both its resources and its patrons. Kings of the Gupta dynasty and later rulers provided funding, land, and protection. Monks lived on site, dedicated to study and teaching. Scholars maintained strict copying routines to ensure accuracy. Multiple copies of important works were made and stored in separate buildings. Redundancy was built into the system to reduce the risk of total loss. This discipline allowed the library to flourish even during periods of regional instability. Despite careful preservation, Nalanda was not immune to the violence of conquest. In the 12th century of the Common Era, the invading army of Bakhtiar Khilji attacked the region. Contemporary accounts describe the destruction of the monastery and its library. Manuscripts were set on fire, scholars were killed or dispersed, and buildings were razed. The accumulated work of centuries vanished in days. What had survived political changes, natural decay, and oral transmission could not withstand the sudden violence. The loss at Nalanda illustrates a broader historical pattern. Libraries and monastic centers depend on political stability, patronage, and protection. When those conditions fail, knowledge can be destroyed almost instantly. Unlike decay or neglect, war does not gradually erase memory. It severs the chain of custodians, leaving silence where information once lived. Entire philosophical, religious, and scientific traditions can disappear when a single institution is attacked. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of destruction. Excavations reveal charred remnants, collapsed walls, and scattered fragments of manuscripts. The loss was not limited to books. It included commentary, teaching lineages, and scholarly debates. These intangible elements were as important as the texts themselves for preserving understanding across generations. Without them, future generations lacked the context to reconstruct the knowledge fully. The story of Nalanda also shows the limits of redundancy. While some manuscripts may have been copied elsewhere, the centralization of expertise and resources meant that much of the intellectual network depended on the physical campus. Once the campus was destroyed, dispersal was incomplete. Even surviving texts could not convey the depth of learning or the interpretive traditions developed over centuries. Nalanda's destruction is a reminder that preservation is never absolute. Even disciplined copying, careful storage, and royal support cannot guarantee survival against sudden violence. Knowledge is vulnerable to both material loss and the disruption of human custodians. When empires collapse or armies attack, centuries of work can vanish in days. The case of Nalanda stands as a historical warning that the greatest libraries can be consumed by war, leaving gaps in human memory that may never be recovered. The transition from scroll to codex was one of the most important changes in the history of written knowledge. Scrolls had dominated the ancient world for thousands of years. They were long rolls of papyrus or parchment that had to be unrolled and read sequentially. This made storage, transport, and referencing difficult. A scroll could only hold so much text and was vulnerable to wear, fire, and decay. Codices, or bound books, emerged around the 1st century of the Common Era and gradually replaced scrolls. Codices were easier to handle. Pages could be turned quickly. Specific passages could be located with index marks or references, and the format allowed for writing on both sides of the material. This innovation dramatically increased efficiency in copying, teaching, and preserving texts. Scholars could carry multiple works at once. Libraries could organize collections more compactly and systematically. The physical advantages of the codex contributed to the survival of certain texts over others. The codex also played a role in the canonization of scripture. Early Christian communities, for example, adopted the codex in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The format made it easier to compile multiple writings into a single volume, reinforcing the authority of selected texts. Works that were included could be copied more efficiently, distributed widely, and read consistently across communities. Texts left out of these early compilations were copied less and gradually disappeared. Material durability mattered as well. Codices were often made from parchment rather than papyrus, which was more resilient to climate and handling. Parchment could survive centuries if stored properly, whereas papyrus scrolls decayed quickly in humid or wet conditions. The choice of codex and material influenced which ideas, scriptures, and records survived the instability of the late antique period. The format change also allowed libraries and monasteries to create larger, more organized collections. Texts could be arranged by subject, author, or theological importance. Copyists could work systematically from one page to the next, reducing errors and improving consistency. The codex encouraged the creation of reference systems, marginal notes, and commentary that were difficult to implement on scrolls. This increased the scholarly value of texts and reinforced preservation. Not all scrolls disappeared immediately. The shift was gradual, with scrolls coexisting alongside codices for several centuries. However, over time, the advantages of the codex led to the replacement of most scroll-based collections. This transformation was not neutral. Texts suitable for codex format, or considered authoritative, were more likely to survive. Those that were unwieldy, localized, or non-canonical were left vulnerable to loss. The revolution from scroll to codex demonstrates how technology shapes memory. Survival of texts depended not only on content, but on form. Codices allowed ideas to be copied, transported, and standardized more effectively than scrolls ever could. Libraries could expand, and scholars could collaborate more efficiently. At the same time, the codex contributed to the selective preservation of knowledge, favoring certain traditions while marginalizing others. The shift reshaped human memory and determined what would endure for centuries to come. Religious communities have always faced the challenge of deciding which texts define belief and which do not. During the first few centuries of the Common Era, Christian leaders debated which Gospels, letters and writings should be considered authoritative. Councils and synods examined texts for consistency with emerging doctrine. Works that did not align with accepted theology were excluded. These excluded texts became what scholars later called apocrypha. Being apocryphal did not mean false, only that the community decided they would not be part of official scripture. Similar processes occurred in Judaism and other religious traditions. The Hebrew Bible was canonized over centuries with debates about which books belonged. The Septuagint, a Greek translation from the 3rd century before the Common Era, included additional works that were later excluded from Jewish tradition. These texts survived in some Christian circles but were not universally accepted. Decisions about inclusion shaped what would be copied, preserved, and taught. Texts outside the canon faced a slow decline as copying prioritized accepted scripture. The consequences were profound. Beloved stories, philosophical reflections, and alternative teachings were no longer reproduced systematically. Monks, scribes, and educators focused on canonical texts. Manuscripts not deemed official were less likely to be recopied when worn or damaged. Over time, absence became the same as disappearance. What was once read widely and cherished could vanish from the historical record without a single fire or conquest. Apocryphal texts often survived in fragmentary form. Some were preserved in isolated communities, in remote monasteries, or hidden in private collections. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and other writings were rediscovered centuries later, often buried in manuscripts in Egypt. Their survival was accidental, dependent on chance rather than institutional support. Most apocryphal texts were lost forever, their ideas remembered only through references in surviving works. The act of canon formation was not neutral. It was a process of selection, shaping collective memory. Leaders determined which teachings would define belief, practice, and education. This selection influenced generations, affecting what people learned, debated, and valued. Knowledge outside the canon became marginalized, contributing to gaps in historical understanding. What we read today is heavily influenced by these early choices about inclusion and exclusion. Canonization also affected translation and distribution. Official texts were copied widely and translated into multiple languages. Apocryphal texts rarely received the same attention. This reinforced their marginalization. Languages and regions where official scripture dominated became more uniform in what they preserved. Divergent voices faded under the weight of institutional preference. Understanding canon and apocrypha helps explain why religious history contains silences. Books were lost not only by destruction, but by deliberate omission. Exclusion determined survival. Libraries, scribes, and communities copied selectively, and those choices shaped what future generations could access. In this way, canon makers controlled memory as effectively as any fire or war. Decisions about authority left lasting gaps, shaping the cultural and spiritual landscape for centuries. Byzantium became a critical hub for the preservation of knowledge when the Western Roman Empire began to collapse in the 5th century of the Common Eras. While the West experienced political fragmentation and the decline of public institutions, the Eastern Roman Empire maintained a relatively stable government and robust scholarly culture. Monasteries and imperial scriptoria in Constantinople and other cities became centers for copying texts. These scribes preserved classical literature, theological treatises, and legal codes that might otherwise have disappeared. Eastern Roman scholars were highly trained and often worked within monastic settings, where copying was both a spiritual and intellectual duty. They reproduced texts in Greek and Latin, maintaining a connection to earlier traditions. Important works by Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates were recopied and stored in Byzantine libraries, ensuring that Western Europe could later rediscover them during the Renaissance. These manuscripts included not only philosophical and scientific works, but also histories, poetry, and Christian writings that shaped theology and education for centuries. Monasteries provided the necessary structure for preservation. Monks lived disciplined lives with daily routines that included study, prayer, and copying manuscripts. Libraries were carefully maintained, and multiple copies of important texts were produced to reduce the risk of total loss. Even as wars and political instability affected some regions, monasteries acted as lifelines, safeguarding knowledge that might have otherwise vanished. The Byzantine Empire also benefited from strong connections across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Trade, diplomacy, and religious networks facilitated the exchange of texts. Scholars and monks could access works from Alexandria, Pergamon, and other centers of learning. This circulation ensured that even if a collection in one location was damaged or destroyed, copies survived elsewhere. Preservation was reinforced by redundancy and distribution, creating a resilient intellectual network. The role of the Byzantine scribes was not limited to copying. They also annotated, commented upon, and sometimes translated texts. These interventions helped interpret ancient knowledge for contemporary audiences while preserving its core content. The careful attention to language and meaning ensured that the essence of classical thought survived the centuries. Without these efforts, many key works that shaped later European philosophy, science, and theology might have been lost entirely. Byzantine preservation also had long-term consequences for the West. When scholars in Italy and other parts of Europe began to re-engage with classical knowledge in the 11th and 12th centuries, they relied on Byzantine manuscripts. The revival of Greek studies, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy depended on the survival of these texts. Byzantium acted as a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, keeping knowledge alive when much of Western Europe lacked institutional support. The scribal lifeline of Byzantium demonstrates how stable institutions, disciplined copying, and regional networks can protect knowledge against political collapse and social upheaval. Preservation was an active process requiring dedication and resources. It highlights the importance of human effort in maintaining memory. Without Byzantium's commitment to copying and safeguarding texts, the intellectual landscape of Europe would have been dramatically diminished, leaving many strands of ancient thought lost to history forever. In the 8th century of the Common Era, Baghdad became the intellectual heart of the Islamic world under the Abbasid caliphs. The city housed the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, a center dedicated to the collection, translation, and study of knowledge from across the known world. Scholars brought texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions and translated them into Arabic. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature flowed into Baghdad, creating a new cultural synthesis. The translation movement was systematic and state-supported. Caliphs like Al-Mansur and Harun al-Rashid funded teams of scholars, copyists, and translators. Greek works by Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy were rendered into Arabic alongside Indian texts on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Persian histories and philosophical treatises were also collected. This activity preserved knowledge that might have been lost in regions facing war, decay, or neglect. Without Baghdad's commitment to translation and copying, many classical works would have disappeared. Scribes and translators used rigorous methods to ensure accuracy. Texts were checked against multiple sources and revised carefully. Arabic became a unifying language for intellectual exchange. This allowed scholars from different regions to access, critique, and build upon earlier knowledge. The process transformed the original ideas as they were adapted to new cultural and religious contexts, but the core content survived. Baghdad's libraries were extensive and organized. Manuscripts were stored in specialized collections, catalogued and maintained. Scholars could study works from multiple disciplines in one location. This concentration of knowledge created opportunities for synthesis and innovation. Algebra, optics, and advancements in medicine flourished because classical and non-classical sources were preserved together. The House of Wisdom was not just a repository, it was a laboratory of ideas. The Abbasid translation movement also had long-term effects on Europe. Many Arabic texts were later translated into Latin in centers like Toledo and Sicily during the 11th and 12th centuries. European scholars gained access to preserved Greek and Indian learning through these Arabic versions. Works of Euclid, Archimedes, and Galen that might have been lost in the West were reintroduced. Baghdad became a crucial link in the chain of human knowledge spanning continents and centuries. Preservation in Baghdad depended on political stability, funding, and a culture that valued scholarship. Unlike libraries vulnerable to conquest or neglect, the House of Wisdom thrived because the state supported intellectual life. Copyists, translators, and teachers formed a network that safeguarded knowledge for future generations. The system shows that preservation requires both human effort and institutional commitment. Baghdad and the House of Wisdom demonstrate that knowledge survives not only through material durability, but through active engagement and dissemination. Texts from diverse traditions were saved, translated, and adapted, ensuring that ideas endured beyond their original contexts. The Abbasid approach preserved and transformed older intellectual worlds, making Baghdad a central bridge connecting classical, Persian, Indian, and eventually European scholarship. Its legacy is a testament to the power of organized, sustained efforts to protect human memory. In 1258 of the Common Era, the Mongols led by Hulagu Khan captured Baghdad, marking one of the most catastrophic events in the history of knowledge preservation. The city had been a major center of learning for centuries, home to the House of Wisdom, countless libraries, religious schools, and private collections. Scholars, scribes, and citizens had amassed texts from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Islamic traditions. When the Mongols entered the city, this intellectual world was devastated. Accounts from the period describe massive destruction. Buildings were razed, libraries looted, and manuscripts thrown into the Tigris River. Chroniclers claimed the river ran black with ink from thousands of burned or submerged books. Scientific works, philosophical treatises, religious texts, poetry, and historical records were lost. Centuries of careful copying and preservation were undone in a matter of days. The scale of the loss was nearly unimaginable, leaving gaps in the historical record that would never be fully restored. The Mongol assault was both a military and cultural catastrophe. Unlike prior losses caused by neglect or political instability, this was deliberate destruction. Scholars were killed, educators dispersed, and the social networks that supported preservation were destroyed. Without custodians, manuscripts couldn't survive, even if hidden or stored. The combination of fire, looting, and violence created a rupture in cultural memory that affected the Islamic world and beyond. The consequences extended far beyond Baghdad. Texts that had been copied there and shared with other cities were now lost. Works of science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy that had flourished under Abbasid patronage disappeared. Later generations would only know fragments through citations or copies that had reached distant centers before the destruction. The loss slowed scientific progress in the region and diminished the continuity of classical knowledge that had been preserved through translation and study. The sack of Baghdad demonstrates how fragile centralized knowledge can be. Institutions, no matter how well funded or organized, are vulnerable to sudden violence. Centuries of intellectual labor depend on stability and protection. When those conditions fail, entire traditions can vanish almost instantly. The destruction also highlights the importance of redundancy and dissemination. Knowledge concentrated in one location is at high risk if disaster strikes. Despite the devastation, some texts survived in peripheral regions. Scholars who had traveled with copies, works that had been sent abroad, or manuscripts hidden by families were occasionally preserved. These fragments allowed partial reconstruction of earlier knowledge, but the continuity and comprehensiveness of Baghdad's libraries were lost forever. The events of 1258 remain a symbol of cultural rupture. They remind us that human memory, even when meticulously copied and preserved, is vulnerable to sudden and violent change. Baghdad's books met the Tigris, and much of the intellectual world was submerged in loss. The city's destruction illustrates that the survival of knowledge depends not only on careful copying, but also on the security of the institutions, communities, and social networks that protect it. It is a warning from history about how quickly centuries of preservation can be undone. In medieval Europe, certain regions became crucial bridges for the recovery of lost knowledge. Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily in the central Mediterranean served as contact zones where cultures, languages, and traditions intersected. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked together, translating texts from Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew into Latin. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and commentary that might have been lost in fragmented or war-torn regions were rescued and transmitted to Europe. The process was systematic and collaborative. In cities such as Toledo in the 12th century of the Common Era, teams of translators worked under the direction of both religious and secular authorities. Arabic texts preserved from Baghdad, Cordoba, and other centers were rendered into Latin, allowing European scholars to access centuries of accumulated knowledge. Works of Aristotle, Galen, Avicenna, and Al-Khwarizmi were made available to a new audience. Sicily played a similar role after its conquest by the Normans in the 11th century of the Common Era. The island's multicultural population created a fertile environment for scholarship. Greek, Latin, and Arabic texts were copied and translated in monasteries and court libraries. Scholars there preserved medical treatises, astronomical calculations, and philosophical works that had been maintained in Islamic and Byzantine traditions. These translations helped reintroduce classical learning to Western Europe at a time when many original manuscripts were lost or inaccessible. The importance of these borderlands lies in their ability to protect knowledge from regional collapse. While the West had experienced the fall of the Roman Empire and repeated invasions, Al-Andalus and Sicily remained relatively stable. Their libraries and scholarly networks acted as reservoirs of memory. Translators not only preserved texts, but also interpreted them, sometimes adding commentary to clarify complex ideas for new audiences. This ensured continuity across cultural and temporal gaps. Translation was more than linguistic. Scholars had to understand concepts, contextualize theories, and reconcile different philosophical systems. Medical texts required knowledge of terminology and practical application. Philosophical works demanded comprehension of argumentation and logic. The work of translators was both intellectual and technical, ensuring that the knowledge survived in a usable form. These recovered texts became the foundation for the European intellectual revival during the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. Universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford drew upon the translated works to teach medicine, law, and philosophy. Without the efforts of translators in Al-Andalus and Sicily, much of Aristotle, Galen, and other classical authorities might have remained inaccessible to Western Europe for centuries longer. The story of these contact zones demonstrates that knowledge can survive political and cultural upheaval if preserved in resilient, multicultural networks. Libraries alone are not sufficient. Human effort in translation, copying, and interpretation is essential. Al-Andalus and Sicily show that recovery is possible even after regional collapse, and that intellectual bridges can connect distant civilizations, saving ideas that might otherwise have vanished from memory. European monasteries played a central role in the preservation of knowledge during the early and high Middle Ages. From roughly the 6th to the 12th centuries of the Common Era, monks worked in scriptoria, rooms dedicated to the copying of manuscripts. These scribes reproduced religious texts, classical works, and practical treatises. Their efforts ensured that much of ancient learning survived the political and social upheavals of the period. Without these disciplined copying practices, entire bodies of knowledge would have vanished. Monastic copying was selective. Scribes prioritized texts that were valued by their communities or approved by church authorities. Religious works dominated, including the Bible, commentaries, liturgical manuals, and hagiographies. Classical texts in philosophy, medicine, law, and literature were copied when they aligned with theological or educational priorities. Many works that seemed dangerous, obscure, or irrelevant were left aside. Decisions about what to copy were influenced by comprehension, available resources, and perceived importance. Margins in manuscripts reveal much about scribes' priorities and knowledge. Many scribes annotated texts, with corrections, commentary, and notes for future readers. These marginalia sometimes preserved information about older versions of a text, explanations of difficult passages, or cross-references to other works. In some cases, scribes added glosses to clarify scientific, mathematical, or historical content. Margins became spaces of interpretation and preservation alongside the main text. Material constraints also affected survival. Parchment was expensive and time-consuming to prepare. Paper was introduced in Europe only in the 12th century of the Common Era. Scribes had limited space and time, so copying focused on works deemed essential. Lengthy or complex texts were more likely to be abbreviated or summarized. Minor treatises, local histories, or unconventional writings were at risk of being excluded and eventually lost. The monastic environment enforced discipline and accuracy. Texts were often copied line by line with careful attention to spelling and punctuation. Errors could be corrected by consulting older manuscripts. Multiple copies were produced when possible, creating redundancy to reduce the risk of total loss. Despite this, human judgment remained central. Scribes' understanding and values shaped the transmission of knowledge. What was comprehended and respected was more likely to survive than what was obscure or undervalued. Political and religious authority reinforced these priorities. Manuscripts copied under the auspices of abbeys or bishops carried institutional approval. Texts outside the sanctioned canon were less likely to be preserved. This selective preservation created a historical record that emphasized certain traditions and silenced others. Knowledge that survived centuries often reflected institutional choices rather than universal importance. European monastic copying illustrates that preservation depends not only on materials and effort, but also on human judgment. What survived the Middle Ages did so because scribes valued, understood, and were allowed to reproduce it. Margins, annotations, and careful replication created layers of memory that shaped future generations' access to knowledge. The choices made in scriptoria determined which voices endured and which faded into silence, creating the selective archive that informs our understanding of history today. Across Europe in the early Middle Ages, many local sacred stories faced gradual extinction. Oral traditions that had sustained communities for centuries began to lose status as Christianity spread and standardized written texts became dominant. Myths, legends, and ritual narratives tied to pagan practices were increasingly labeled heretical or irrelevant. Storytellers who once preserved these tales found their audiences shrinking and their voices marginalized. Written transmission focused on approved scripture and canonical texts. Monks and scribes copied religious works, commentaries, and theological treatises, leaving little space for local folklore. Even when scribes recorded elements of myth, they often reframed them within Christian moral or allegorical contexts. This process transformed or erased the original cultural meaning of these stories. Over time, knowledge of the old myths faded from collective memory. Christianization played a central role in this loss. By the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, bishops and missionaries encouraged communities to abandon pagan practices. Temples were converted into churches, rituals replaced, and festivals reinterpreted. Stories that had explained natural events, local heroes, or divine intervention were replaced with biblical narratives. As religious authority consolidated, oral traditions disconnected from sanctioned texts were treated as superstition. The decline of oral culture was reinforced by literacy patterns. Only clergy and select elites were taught to read and write, and manuscripts were produced primarily in monasteries. Common people relied less on storytelling for moral or historical education, and more on sermons, liturgy, and catechism. When stories existed only in spoken form, they became increasingly vulnerable to forgetting. The disappearance of communal storytelling networks accelerated the loss of local mythologies. Regional variation also contributed. Myths tied to specific landscapes, rivers, forests, or local deities were often confined to a small population. When those populations were displaced, absorbed into larger political entities, or subjected to new religious practices, the stories weakened. Migration, war, and the centralization of power reduced the conditions that had allowed oral traditions to thrive for centuries. Some myths survived indirectly. Elements were integrated into Christian saints' legends or folk practices. Pagan symbols and narrative motifs were adapted to fit Christian frameworks, preserving fragments in altered form. For example, stories of nature spirits or seasonal rituals were recast as saints' miracles or festival customs. While the original stories were often unrecognizable, traces persisted in cultural memory. The quiet extinction of European myths illustrates the fragility of cultural transmission when formal written systems replace oral practice. Knowledge that depended on community memory, without institutional backing, was at high risk. Monastic and clerical priorities determined which texts survived. Stories that lacked alignment with sanctioned beliefs gradually vanished, leaving gaps in historical and cultural understanding. Understanding this process helps explain why so much early European mythology is reconstructed from fragmentary sources. The stories that disappeared were casualties of religious, social, and educational shifts. The narrowing of transmission to sanctioned texts replaced a diverse oral landscape with a more controlled record, shaping the collective memory of Europe for generations to come. Before the arrival of Europeans, in the 15th and 16th centuries of the Common Era, Mesoamerican societies maintained complex systems of written and painted records. The Maya, Mixtec, and Aztec civilizations produced codices on bark paper and deerskin, where myth, astronomy, ritual, and history were inseparable. These books contained genealogies of rulers, calendrical calculations, religious ceremonies, and cosmological narratives. They were central to cultural memory and governance. Mesoamerican scribes, often priests or highly trained specialists, used pictographic and ideographic symbols to encode information. These symbols combined visual representation with phonetic or conceptual meaning, allowing complex ideas to be recorded across generations. Knowledge of the calendar, cycles of the sun and moon, and ritual schedules relied on precise notation. Astronomy and myth were intertwined because understanding celestial movements was essential for agricultural and ceremonial planning. The codices were fragile and vulnerable. Bark paper and deerskin required careful preparation and maintenance. Humidity, insects, and fire threatened survival. Preservation depended on continued copying, communal storage, and ritual protection. These books were treated as sacred objects, and access was often restricted to priestly classes. This careful stewardship ensured continuity, but it also meant that if a codex was destroyed, the knowledge it contained could be lost irretrievably. European contact in the early 16th century introduced catastrophic disruption. Conquistadors, missionaries, and colonial administrators often viewed indigenous religious texts as idolatrous or heretical. Mass burnings of codices occurred under the direction of church authorities who sought to suppress native beliefs and replace them with Christianity. Entire libraries were destroyed, including works containing astronomical observations, historical records, and cultural narratives. The loss was profound, erasing centuries of accumulated knowledge in a matter of years. Some codices survived by being hidden or sent to remote locations. Others were copied or incorporated into new manuscripts, preserving fragments of myth, ritual, and history. The Dresden Codex, the Codex Borgia, and the Codex Mendoza are examples that provide glimpses into the intellectual and religious life of pre-Columbian societies. These surviving texts reveal sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and ritual structure. The experience of the Americas before the flames demonstrates the vulnerability of knowledge dependent on fragile media and centralized custodians. Unlike oral traditions that could adapt to changing circumstances, codices required careful preservation and were immediately threatened by conquest. The combination of material fragility and external aggression made these texts exceptionally vulnerable. Mesoamerican codices also illustrate how writing integrates multiple domains of knowledge. Myth, ritual, and science were inseparable, reflecting a worldview where culture, religion, and observation of the natural world were connected. The destruction of these books was not only a loss of texts, but a rupture in the transmission of entire intellectual frameworks. The Americas before the flames remind us that human memory, even when documented, can be obliterated in moments, leaving only partial traces for future generations to reconstruct. During the 16th century of the Common Era, Spanish colonial authorities conducted campaigns against indigenous religions across the Americas. These campaigns targeted what they called idolatry, including painted codices, ritual objects, and temple records. Priests and administrators often burned manuscripts in public ceremonies or confiscated them for destruction. Entire collections of historical, astronomical, and ritual texts were lost in these auto-da-fe events, erasing centuries of indigenous knowledge. The impact on cultural memory was profound. Indigenous codices contained genealogies, local histories, calendars, and mythologies. They were essential tools for governance, education, and ritual practice. When they were destroyed, communities lost both practical guidance and historical continuity. Knowledge that had been carefully recorded over generations suddenly became inaccessible, leaving later generations dependent on fragments or oral memory for reconstruction. Surviving codices are extremely rare. The Codex Mendoza, the Codex Borgia, and the Dresden Codex represent small fractions of what existed before the colonial campaigns. These works were preserved either by being hidden, smuggled, or copied, in part by early European scholars who recognized their value. Because so few texts survived intact, later reconstructions of indigenous history and culture rely on piecemeal evidence, cross-referencing oral traditions, colonial records, and the small number of codices that escaped destruction. The systematic targeting of manuscripts was part of a broader strategy to consolidate control. By eliminating indigenous texts, Spanish authorities sought to suppress native religion and culture, replacing them with Christian beliefs and European institutions. The destruction of codices was not random. Priests specifically identified texts that contained ritual instructions, genealogical information, or cosmological knowledge that could reinforce indigenous authority. These targeted losses left gaps in historical understanding that remain today. The loss of codices also had long-term consequences for scholarship. Early European historians and chroniclers had limited access to surviving manuscripts. Their accounts were filtered through colonial perspectives, often misunderstanding or misrepresenting indigenous practices. Without original sources, reconstructing accurate histories of pre-Columbian societies became difficult. Scholars must rely on fragmentary evidence, interpreting symbols and surviving passages to piece together religious, scientific, and cultural systems. This period demonstrates how preservation depends on both material security and social acceptance. indigenous codices survived for centuries in controlled, sacred contexts. Once these protections were removed, manuscripts became extremely vulnerable. The combination of colonial conquest, religious zeal, and centralized authority ensured that the knowledge stored in codices was widely destroyed. The autodafe of indigenous codices shows that the disappearance of texts is not always the result of natural decay or neglect. Targeted campaigns can obliterate knowledge almost instantly. Later generations inherit a patchwork of evidence, dependent on fragments and memory. This historical reality highlights the fragility of human memory and the importance of safeguarding diverse sources of knowledge against deliberate destruction. The codices that survived are precious witnesses to cultures that endured even under the most extreme threats to their intellectual heritage. The Renaissance in Europe, beginning in the 14th century of the Common Era, was not a spontaneous emergence of knowledge, but a complex process of rediscovery. Many texts that fueled the revival of art, science, and philosophy had been preserved in regions far from Western Europe. Byzantine scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453 brought Greek manuscripts, including works by Plato, Aristotle, and Galen, which had been copied and maintained for centuries. These texts reintroduced ideas that had been lost or inaccessible in the West during the so-called Dark Ages. Italy, especially cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome, became centers for collecting and studying these preserved manuscripts. Wealthy patrons and humanist scholars funded the acquisition of classical works from Eastern Europe and the Islamic world. Latin translations of Arabic versions of Greek texts were also critical, especially in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Figures like Gerard of Cremona and Constantine the African translated scientific and philosophical works that had survived in the Islamic world and brought them back into European intellectual life. The rediscovery process was selective and sometimes incomplete. Many texts arrived in fragmentary form or had been copied with errors or interpretations layered over centuries. Scholars had to reconstruct meanings, often misunderstanding or misreading ancient intentions. This produced a Renaissance that was both authentic and reinterpreted, a blend of recovered knowledge and contemporary adaptation. The European revival depended as much on what survived outside its borders as on local innovation. Art and literature benefited directly from preserved texts. Humanist scholars studying classical rhetoric, poetry, and history relied on manuscripts copied in Byzantine and Islamic libraries. Architects referenced Vitruvius and other classical engineers, while painters and sculptors examined classical forms recorded in surviving manuscripts. Even philosophy and ethics were revitalized by Greek and Roman works that had been safeguarded in monasteries and urban centers outside Western Europe. The survival of manuscripts often hinged on networks of preservation. Monastic scriptoria, Islamic libraries, and private collections had protected texts through political instability, wars, and natural decay. While Western Europe experienced fragmentation and limited literacy, other regions maintained copying and translation practices that ensured continuity. Renaissance Europe was able to access this preserved knowledge because it had survived in these dispersed, sometimes unexpected locations. This period also highlights the fragility of cultural memory. Knowledge could be preserved for centuries, yet remain out of reach until social, political, or economic circumstances allowed its recovery. Renaissance scholars depended on the luck of survival. the foresight of previous custodians, and the skill of translators and copyists. Many ideas re-entered Europe not as fully intact works, but as fragments that needed interpretation. The story of Renaissance rediscoveries shows that cultural revival is rarely isolated. Lost stories, scientific principles, and artistic techniques sometimes survive just out of reach, waiting for the right moment and context to re-emerge. Preservation across borders and generations ensured that Europe could reconnect with knowledge thought lost, revealing the enduring importance of human effort in safeguarding and transmitting intellectual heritage across time and space. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century of the Common Era revolutionized the way texts were produced and distributed. Johannes Gutenberg's movable type allowed for books to be copied quickly, accurately, and in unprecedented numbers. This technology dramatically increased access to knowledge, enabling ideas to circulate across Europe at a speed previously unimaginable. Religious texts, classical works, and scholarly treatises could now reach a far wider audience, fostering literacy and learning. While the press multiplied texts, it also enforced standardization. Printers, editors, and religious authorities controlled what was reproduced, deciding which versions of texts would become widely available. The Bible is a prime example. Early printed editions, such as the Gutenberg Bible, set a precedent for canonical versions, solidifying specific translations and interpretations while excluding alternative readings. Minority traditions, local texts, and apocryphal works were rarely printed, pushing them further to the margins of cultural memory. Religious reform movements like the Protestant Reformation both benefited from and contributed to the power of printing. Martin Luther's works, pamphlets, and translated Bibles spread rapidly, influencing millions. Simultaneously, the Catholic Church used the press to enforce orthodoxy, producing catechisms, indexes of prohibited books, and approved liturgical texts. Printing became a tool for both dissemination and control, shaping which ideas were accessible and which were suppressed. The effect on minority traditions was significant. Local folk stories, regional liturgical practices, and alternative theological interpretations often remained confined to oral tradition or manuscript form. These works were less likely to be printed, and as literacy expanded around standardized texts, unprinted traditions declined in visibility and influence. Communities that had once relied on manuscripts or oral transmission found their knowledge increasingly marginalized. Standardization also influenced scholarship. Textbooks, legal codes, and academic works were printed in uniform editions, creating consistency in education, but narrowing the diversity of perspectives. Readers had access to fewer variant readings and interpretations, which limited critical engagement with alternative or older sources. Knowledge became more centralized, reflecting the priorities of those controlling printing and distribution rather than the full spectrum of human thought. The press reshaped cultural memory by freezing certain texts into fixed forms. Manuscripts had allowed for variation, annotation, and marginal commentary, creating a dynamic and evolving record of knowledge. Printed books reduced this flexibility, making some versions authoritative, while rendering others obsolete. This process reinforced dominant narratives and made it harder for minority voices to survive. Printing both preserved and erased. It saved texts that might have otherwise decayed in manuscript form, yet simultaneously created new absences. Works that were never printed, misinterpreted, or deemed unsuitable for mass production were increasingly forgotten. The power of the press demonstrates that technological innovation can expand access to knowledge while also concentrating authority over what counts as legitimate and what is consigned to obscurity. The era of printing shows that preservation is not neutral. Mass production protects some texts, but can erase others. The choices of printers, religious leaders, and scholars shaped what future generations would know and what would be lost. The press multiplied the reach of human knowledge, yet it also confirmed that control over production is control over memory, defining the boundaries of cultural and intellectual survival. Even when libraries burned and manuscripts vanished from sight, traces of their existence often survived. Quotations in later texts preserved fragments of lost works. Translations carried knowledge across languages and generations, sometimes altering the form, but keeping the content alive. Archaeological discoveries of fragments, inscriptions, and remnants of scrolls reveal the scope of what once existed. Living rituals and oral traditions also maintained memory, providing context for reconstructing vanished practices and beliefs. Scholars today rely on these traces to piece together the intellectual and cultural heritage that power sought to erase. By comparing citations in medieval commentaries, examining marginal notes in surviving manuscripts, and analyzing the structure of preserved works, historians can infer the contents of texts lost to fire, neglect, or deliberate destruction. Libraries such as those of Ashurbanipal, Alexandria, and Baghdad may be gone, but the knowledge they contained echoes in the texts that survived elsewhere. Translation played a crucial role in preservation. Greek works copied into Arabic, then Latin or Sanskrit, texts rendered into Tibetan, allowed ideas to move across continents, even when original copies were destroyed. These linguistic journeys created redundancies that safeguarded knowledge against local catastrophes. The survival of certain classical, religious, and scientific ideas depended on the careful work of scribes, translators, and custodians across time and space. Archaeology adds another layer of recovery. Excavations uncover fragments of codices, clay tablets, and inscriptions that reveal lost historical events, rituals, and scientific observations. Even incomplete pieces can illuminate the structure and content of vanished works. Combined with textual analysis, archaeology allows scholars to reconstruct cultural worlds otherwise hidden beneath centuries of destruction. Oral traditions also contributed to recovery. Communities that maintained stories, chants, and ceremonial practices preserved knowledge in a flexible form. When written texts were destroyed, oral memory kept concepts alive, allowing later scholars to record what had been lost. Folklore, ritual practices, and cultural customs provide insight into social structures, beliefs, and intellectual frameworks of civilizations whose libraries no longer exist. The afterlife of burned libraries demonstrates that knowledge is resilient. Even deliberate attempts to erase human memory cannot fully succeed. Fragments, quotations, translations, and traditions act as threads connecting past and present, enabling reconstruction of lost worlds. Preservation is rarely complete, but careful scholarship can recover patterns, meanings, and knowledge that would otherwise be invisible. This recovery also underscores the importance of redundancy and dissemination. Centralized collections, while vulnerable to destruction, can be counterbalanced by copies and records distributed across regions. Networks of scholars, religious institutions, and communities act as repositories of collective memory, ensuring that the disappearance of a single library does not erase an entire intellectual tradition. Ultimately, the story of burned libraries is not only about loss, but also about survival. Knowledge may be hidden, fragmented, or obscured, but it leaves traces that allow future generations to rebuild, reinterpret, and understand. Even when power seeks to control what is remembered, the persistence of texts, translations, archaeology, and living ritual demonstrates that human memory finds ways to endure, allowing careful scholarship to illuminate the worlds that were almost lost.